I never imagined the beginning of my marriage's collapse would play out under vaulted ceilings and soft museum lighting, surrounded by oil paintings and silent strangers in black. The memorial for Charles Dalton, my late father-in-law, was being held in one of the largest halls of the Seattle Art Museum. Rows of polished wooden chairs had been arranged facing a raised stage draped in white fabric. The air carried the faint scent of lilies mixed with old wood, and somewhere overhead, a string quartet played slow, steady movements that seemed to press against my ribs. I had been placed, not seated, placed far from the front, my chair tucked against a side wall near a sculpture exhibit. Brooke was in the front row, flanked by Charles's closest friends and extended family, her profile bathed in the amber light filtering through the high windows. She looked composed, elegant, the image of a grieving daughter. From here, I could almost believe it if I didn't already know something was off. The first hour passed with eulogies and formal tributes. My attention kept drifting, not because the words weren't moving, but because my eyes wouldn't leave Brooke. She wasn't crying, but every so often she'd lower her gaze, thumb brushing the thin chain bracelet on her wrist. Then, halfway through a speech by one of Charles's colleagues, her smartwatch lit up. The screen was angled just enough that the glare off the polished brass rail in front of her reflected the message toward me like some cruel mirror. I caught the words before she tapped them away. Last night was unforgettable. The sender's name, Grayson Hale. Grayson. The name landed like a hammer against my ribs. I knew him. A marketing consultant Brooke had just met a few months back through some philanthropic networking dinner. She had described him as sharp, quick on his feet, the kind of guy who just gets things done. I'd seen his name pop up on her phone before, but never in a context that made my stomach knot the way it just did. She didn't react like someone who'd received an int*mate message at her father's memorial. No flush of embarrassment. No startled glance around to see if anyone had noticed. Just a small, deliberate raise of her wrist, a tap to dismiss the notification, and then she reached for her phone. I watched her thumb swipe across the screen with practiced ease. The phone tilted just enough in her hand for me to see a flash of white. An Uber receipt. My eyes locked on the details before she closed it. 2 passengers. Drop-off at a boutique hotel downtown. Time-stamped 12:14 a.m. That hotel wasn't just boutique in the way travel blogs use the word. It was known locally as a discreet luxury spot. The kind of place people went when they wanted privacy above all else. The cello from the quartet seemed to grow louder in my ears. My mind tried to supply innocent explanations, but each one died before it took shape. I didn't need to jump to conclusions. The message and the receipt together painted their own picture. When the service broke for a short intermission, I told myself I wasn't going to make a scene. I rehearsed a simple version of what I wanted to say. Just a question. A quiet request for clarity. My steps toward the front were slow, controlled, the way you move when you're trying to convince yourself you're not walking into a fire. She saw me before I reached her row. Her expression didn't shift much, just a subtle tightening around the eyes, a flicker of something that could have been annoyance. "Brooke, can we talk for a moment?" I kept my voice low enough that only she could hear. She turned her head toward me, her face still perfectly composed for the benefit of the other mourners. "Mason, not now," she murmured, the warmth in her voice carefully calibrated. "This is hardly the place." "I saw a message," I said, leaning slightly so no one else could catch the words. "From Grayson. And the Uber." Her eyebrows lifted in that polite, faintly incredulous way she used when she wanted to make me feel like I was overreacting. "Grayson and I are working on the Foundation's campaign," she said smoothly. That message was about a donor meeting. Late-night follow-up. My jaw tightened. That's not what it sounded like. Her lips pressed into a gentle smile, as if she were comforting an unreasonable child. "Please," she said. "You're making this awkward. People are watching." Behind her, a man in a dark suit, museum staff or event coordinator, leaned down to whisper something in her ear. She nodded once, her gaze never leaving mine. Within seconds, 2 staff members approached me from the aisle. "Mr. Reed," one asked softly, "would you mind stepping back with us? We're just making a small seating adjustment. I glanced at Brooke, waiting for her to intervene. Instead, she smoothed the skirt of her dress and said, "Mason, why don't you let them help? We'll talk later." The way she said it, measured, public, turned the whole exchange into a performance. Her subtle framing cast me as the one disrupting a solemn event, not the man who'd just seen his wife's loyalty slip like sand through his fingers. They guided me farther back, near the very rear of the hall, behind a column that obscured most of the stage. I sat down slowly, my pulse loud in my ears. Brooke had already turned back toward the front, leaning slightly toward the man next to her, listening as if nothing had happened. From my new vantage point, I could see the back of her head, the graceful slope of her neck above the collar of her dress. She didn't turn around once. The intermission ended, and the program resumed. Voices echoed against the high ceiling, names and dates and anecdotes about Charles's life weaving through the space. I heard none of it. My mind kept replaying those glowing words on her watch, the timestamp on the Uber receipt, the small, almost imperceptible shift in her expression when she saw me walking toward her. Like someone caught mid-step on a rope bridge, suddenly aware of the drop beneath. I stayed put until the final notes of the quartet faded and the hall began to empty. Brooke slipped out with the cluster of family in the front, her hand briefly resting on the arm of a silver-haired man I didn't recognize. By the time I made it outside, she was already in a black sedan, the door closing behind her. I stood on the museum steps as the drizzle began, feeling the damp seep into my suit. The city around me was muted. Tires hissing on wet streets, distant horns, the murmur of people heading to their cars. Somewhere in all that noise, I thought I heard my own voice asking her, "What's going on?" But the memory was already fading under the weight of her carefully placed deflection. I told myself we'd talk later, but even as I thought it, I knew later was her way of saying never. On the drive home from the memorial, Seattle slid by in glassy streaks, taillights smearing red across the wet windshield, while the wipers beat time like a metronome I couldn't shut off. Brooke stared straight ahead, posture perfect, hands at 10 and 2 as if the car were another auditorium and someone was grading her form. We didn't talk. I didn't push. I told myself I would wait until we were off the freeway and back on our quiet street. Wait until the house swallowed up the sound of other people's grief and left us with only ours. It started small, the way erosion starts small. A slider switched off here, a habit rearranged there. Find My stopped working on her phone one Tuesday night. When I asked, she laughed and said an update must have messed up the permissions. We never turned it back on. After that, her late-night fitness sessions multiplied. Peloton at the office gym, she said, or tempo runs on the Burke-Gilman when the city was quiet. Except her routes, on the rare nights I saw them, kept circling the same neighborhood, a tight little loop that had no gym in it and no trail either, just a row of new condos with glass balconies. Cash withdrawals showed up on the joint account like missing teeth. Not large at first, 40 here, 60 there, but regular, patterned. When I asked if she'd started tipping in cash, she joked I'd finally noticed the almond croissants in the morning. We don't eat croissants. We barely eat breakfast together anymore. A new login screen appeared on her laptop. One extra profile I didn't recognize. Protected by a password, she said, was for a consulting client under NDA. Her message threads trimmed themselves into neat, almost sterile histories. Whole chunks missing, timestamps that skipped like scratched vinyl. "You delete your old texts too," she said, "except I don't, and she knows it. I'm the guy who keeps warranty emails from 2016 in case the toaster declares bankruptcy." Then the wardrobe changed. Tailored suits I'd never seen, silk shells arriving in slim garment bags, heels engineered for quiet entrances and quicker exits. The fragrance rotated too, bergamot one week, something smoky and expensive the next. She called it rebranding. She laughed when I said our lives didn't need a mood board. Chicago started as a 2-day strategy session with a donor consortium. By spring it stretched from Thursday morning to late Sunday night. When I suggested tagging along, she smiled like I'd proposed bringing a choir to a deposition. "This isn't tourism," she said. "It's work." Our credit alerts cycled through downtown boutique hotels, each one a few blocks from the river. My calls after 10 went to voicemail. In the morning she texted room service plates, steel coffee carafes, grapefruit halves, a folded napkin, and the window view cropped just above street level, like the city was a secret she wasn't allowed to show me. Around the same time, a new credit card slid into the mail stack, her name only. Points optimization, she said. Optimization would have made sense if any of those points landed in the account we shared. They didn't. What did land were envelopes with the return address blacked out and a new habit of her carrying a wallet I'd never seen before. Family events turned into scheduling conflicts. My sister's baby shower? She urged me to go alone and be present. My mom's birthday dinner? You know how your cousins get after the second bottle. Someone has to keep the trains running here. She started volunteering me out of our own calendar like I was a substitute teacher covering a class nobody wants. Each time I stayed home I felt petty. Each time I went without her I felt replaced. I told myself to catalog facts, not feelings. So I did, badly and obsessively. Shared location off. Fitness check-ins late. Elsewhere, repeated. Cash withdrawn in round numbers at freeway-adjacent ATMs. Laptop locked behind a profile that didn't exist 6 weeks earlier. Messages cropped. Wardrobe upgraded beyond any boardroom she needed to impress. Travel extended, misaligned with agendas. Credit segregated. Family time outsourced to me or postponed. Each entry felt small by itself. Together they read like prep notes for a life staging quietly offstage. The house noticed before I admitted I did. Coffee mugs sat clean on the rack. The dishwasher ran half empty because there were never two of everything anymore. Her side of the closet turned into display, not life. Hangers equidistant, tissue paper still tucked in cuffs. A garment rack appeared in the guest room for staging. And then she started sleeping in there on the nights she needed to be up before dawn. I used to resent the neighbor's dog for barking at 1 a.m. Now I listened for it. The bark meant someone else in the world was awake with me. Every time I tried to confront her, Brooke found a new frame. Work, grief, logistics. She wore reasons the way she wore those silk shells, impeccably, until you noticed the thread pulling at the hem. Why pause our shared workout rings for 6 weeks? Metrics stress me out. Why the cash? I like tipping valets without the awkward wait for the square reader. Why Chicago bleeding into weekends? Flights are cheaper late Sunday, and Monday mornings are all hands. No time to travel. Each answer arrived polished, laminated, and not quite the shape of the question. So I started tracking the ordinary. The smell of hotel shampoo on Tuesday mornings. Hair that returned from post-run, not damp but perfectly set, the kind of smoothness you get from a dryer, not sweat. A faint red strap mark on her forearm from a bag she didn't own. A duplicate key on the hook that fit none of our locks. Nothing illegal. Everything loud. Friends noticed me wearing down before I could frame it. You look tired, they said. Everything okay? I said yes, because that's what you say when you don't have evidence you can set on the table. Evidence felt like the only language she wouldn't translate into something else. Some nights I sat in the driveway, engine ticking, watching our windows. One light on in the guest room. The soft stutter of the treadmill in the garage starting and stopping, like a heart trying to remember its job. I'd check our account and see a studio class charge across town stamped the very minute the treadmill belt squeaked. Parallel lives aligned only by timestamp. What pushed me from discomfort into certainty wasn't any single item. It was the choreography, the way each new explanation required the invention of two more. The story lengthened like a shadow at dusk, thinner and more unbelievable as it stretched. It felt like preparation for exit. Not a fight. Not even an affair, not yet, not proved. Preparation. Space carved out of ordinary days where a parallel life could live and breathe and feed. One night, after we dropped memorial flowers at her father's office, she proposed separate cars, so you can head to your sister's after. It wasn't on my calendar. It wasn't her tone that got me. It was how cleanly I fit into her logistics, like a package routed away from a delivery zone that changed while no one was looking. I followed her taillights 3 exits, then watched her veer toward a neighborhood that contained neither her father's office, nor my sister, nor anything we'd named out loud. I didn't follow farther. Not that night. I drove home and poured it all into a note titled Housekeeping. As if maintenance language could tame it. The cursor blinked at the end of a paragraph that read like a police report written by a man who still believed love was a jurisdiction. The next morning she left early. A kiss on my cheek so precise it felt pre-recorded. When the door closed, the house exhaled. I opened the guest room closet. On the garment rack, between the suits and silk, hung a nylon duffel I'd never seen. Inside, running shoes with clean soles, a second toiletries kit with a travel-size bottle of the smoky perfume, and an Uber receipt folded twice, Chicago at the top, a downtown hotel in the middle, 12:11 a.m. At the bottom. None of it would win a courtroom. All of it told the same story. A new life sketched in pencil inside the margins of ours, darkening line by line until the outline was visible even in the rain-glossed reflection of a museum railing. The confirmation didn't come from my own digging. It came in a flat, unmarked envelope slid across a conference table by the family attorney. His fingers resting on it for an extra beat as if to say, I'm not enjoying this either. Charles Dalton's estate was complicated. Layers of trusts, side agreements, and entities that seemed to exist for no reason except to own other entities. As executor, the attorney was tasked with sorting through years of files. He said some things had crossed over into personal matters, and that I might want to see them before they went to the trust council. Inside the envelope was a printout of access logs and camera stills from Charles's penthouse. Security records I didn't even know existed. My thumb hesitated on the first page, like maybe if I delayed reading it, I could stop whatever was about to happen from becoming real. The log entries were clinical. Date, March 14th, 11:42 p.m. Brooke Reed, guest, Grayson Hale authorized entry. Date, March 15th, 5:53 a.m. Brooke Reed, guest, Grayson Hale departure. Below the logs were grainy, high-resolution captures from the elevator's interior camera. Brooke in a black dress I'd never seen. Grayson in a tailored navy suit. The timestamp in the corner blinked midnight as they stepped onto the private floor together. His hand found the small of her back with the kind of familiarity you don't fake. She leaned into him. The next capture was from the same angle hours later. They were laughing. Brooke's hair was slightly mussed, her shoes dangling from her fingertips. Grayson's tie was gone, top button open. The documentation left no foothold for doubt. No way to wedge in an innocent explanation. She hadn't stumbled into the wrong building. She hadn't been locked out of our place and called him for help. She had used my late father-in-law's private residence. His space, for whatever she and Grayson were doing until morning. I stared at the stills long enough that the shapes blurred. There's something about photographic proof that makes the whole concept of denial collapse. Suspicion is survivable. You can walk around with it in your chest and still make breakfast. Proof is final. It has weight. When I looked up, the attorney's expression hadn't changed, but his eyes had that guarded sympathy professionals get when they know your life just shifted by degrees you can't measure yet. The Trust Security Review flagged these, he said. Given your role in the estate proceedings, it's appropriate you see them. Who else has? My voice came out steady, which surprised me. Only the audit subcommittee and myself. The council will be briefed if it becomes relevant to the trust's interests. I knew what that meant. The estate had moral clauses, old-fashioned language Charles liked, tying distributions to conduct that could bring disrepute to the Dalton name. I hadn't thought about those provisions since he'd explained them over brandy one Christmas, laughing about keeping the foxes out of the henhouse. Now I wondered if he'd seen this exact scenario coming. When I left the office, the envelope felt heavier than when I'd walked in. Outside, the city had one of those thin afternoon rains that made everything look sharper, edges more defined. The pedestrians at the crosswalk seemed to move with purpose. I envied them for having destinations that didn't involve the collapse of their marriage. At home, Brooke was in the kitchen, phone on speaker, discussing floral arrangements for an int** mate donor salon. Her tone was all breezy authority, The way she spoke when she wanted the person on the other end to believe she was orchestrating something far more elegant than reality. I slid the envelope onto the counter between us. "From the estate attorney," I said. "You should look at it." She glanced down, still mid-sentence on her call. "Hold on a second, Claire," she said sweetly, pressing mute. "Mason, I'm in the middle of. Just look." Her fingers hesitated on the flap, then pulled out the pages. She scanned the first log entry, and I saw it, the fractional hitch in her breathing, the microshift of her weight from one foot to the other. She turned to the second page, the stills, and her jaw tightened. When her eyes came up to mine, they were already calculating. "This is work-related," she said evenly. "Grayson and I were finalizing language for the capital campaign. Charles's penthouse was a neutral space where we wouldn't be disturbed. Until 6 in the morning. Her expression didn't flicker. It was a long night. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of how quickly she could frame something damning into something she thought was survivable. It was the same technique she'd used at the memorial: pivot, redefine, accuse me of reading it wrong. "This isn't about my interpretation," I said, tapping the timestamp. "It's about the facts." She slid the pages back into the envelope with the precision of someone closing a file they never wanted to open again. "Mason, we're in the middle of estate proceedings. The optics of you making unfounded accusations." "It's not unfounded," I cut in. "It's documented. You walked him into Charles's private residence. You stayed all night. You left with him." She studied me for a long moment, the silence stretching like she was weighing whether to fight harder or let it drop. Then she reached for her phone, unmuted the call, and resumed talking to Claire about hydrangeas. I left the room before the conversation turned back into Latin plant names. Upstairs, I set the envelope on my desk, stared at it until the rain outside turned the window into a blurred watercolor. Proof sat 3 feet away, and yet the house felt no different. Proof doesn't undo the months of doubt. It just ends the debate. That night, she came to bed late, moving quietly, as if courtesy could erase the images. I lay still, pretending to sleep. At some point I realized the pretending was for me, not her. The week after I saw the elevator stills, the estate machinery shifted from quiet hum to grinding gears. Emails multiplied, calendar invites stacked, and then an odd message dropped at 7:13 a.m. Preliminary trust distribution. Acknowledgement required. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Brooke. She didn't bring it up over coffee. I found out because the family office controller called my cell by mistake, thinking I was with her. "Wire confirmed," he said briskly. "Initial advance released per legacy trust. Congratulations." I didn't say anything. He realized the mix-up 2 sentences later, apologized, and hung up. By noon, Brooke's energy had a new voltage. She floated through the house talking about momentum, fingers skimming the backs of chairs like she was already blessing rooms that belonged to her. That afternoon, she forwarded a PDF titled Santa Barbara. Shortlist. Ocean views. Glass walls. Gated drives. She marked one with a star and added, "This is the one. We can finally do the work the right way." By work, she meant a foundation with her name on the masthead. Deposits went out the door within days, retainers for branding, a pledge for a gala site, interviews lined up for an executive director who used to run a museum wing. She ordered letterhead before the ink on anything else was dry. When I asked about budget, she smiled like a benefactor in a magazine profile. Impact first. Numbers settle themselves when the vision is clear. At dinner, she spoke in future tense. A wellness retreat for stakeholders. A summer residence on the bluff to host dialogues. She said we, but the pronoun slid every time I tried to catch it. When I asked the amount of the advance, she said, "Not everything has to be transparent, Mason." As if transparency were a cute personality quirk I'd picked up in college. I didn't argue. The truth would arrive on its own schedule. It did, a week later, in a wood-paneled conference room that smelled faintly like legal pads and the kind of citrus cleaner nobody can pronounce. The will was being unsealed. The attorney asked for silence and read. Charles's voice came through the document so clearly I could hear him clearing his throat between paragraphs. Provisions stacked on provisions. Bequests to cousins, staff, the scholarship endowment he loved. Then the parts that mattered to the living in that room. Personal effects, the attorney said. To Brooke Dalton Reed. A list followed: jewelry, art she had grown up with, the piano her mother once taught her on. A fixed distribution of $2 million to Brooke, to be delivered in fee simple. I watched her chin lift, the small anticipatory inhale right before the main course lands. Then, the residue of the Dalton estate, including majority voting control over the operating companies, to my son-in-law Mason Reed. The sentence fell into the room like a stone into a still bay. There was no splash, just pressure. Someone's pen clicked and then stopped. Brooke didn't move. Her eyes remained politely forward, as if not looking would rewind the words and select a different track. The attorney continued. A supplemental instruction. Should Mason establish any joint financial account, entity, or venture with Brooke within 24 months of my passing, 40% of the estate's assets will be automatically redirected to Seattle Children's Pediatric Oncology Center, with the remainder held in trust under the same conditions. The room exhaled without me. I kept my hands flat on the table. The moral clause Charles used to joke about had been tightened into machinery. It didn't merely discourage collusion. We *P***nized philanthropy against it. If I tried to patch things with her financially, the money would bypass both of us and go save other people's kids. I could hear Charles in that. A kind man who never forgot to install a deadbolt. Brooke blinked once, then twice. This must be preliminary language, she said faintly, but the attorney was already explaining that the earlier wire had been a routine advance from an older trust with automatic triggers at death. Money meant to keep households steady while documents settled. The final will, he said, superseded every unsealed instruction. Reconciliation and recalculation were inevitable. I've already made commitments, she said, voice regaining a layer of steel. Real estate, staffing, charitable pledges. We're in escrow. The attorney nodded sympathetically without yielding an inch. All commitments are subject to available assets and compliance with the will. The council will expect any deposits to be returned. If a vendor refuses, they'll deal with us. She looked at me then, not in appeal, not yet. It was colder, like a measuring. You knew, she said. I didn't, I answered, which was true and also unhelpful. I knew the type of man Charles was. I didn't know the exact shape of his last parachute. After the meeting, the corridor felt longer than it had when I walked in. Brooke walked ahead of me, her heels striking the marble like metronome ticks you can't speed up or slow down. At the elevator, she pressed the button hard enough to make a point. The doors opened on polished steel and our reflections stacked against each other. She didn't look at hers. She looked at mine. You realize what this does to me, she said. Brooke, the will does what it does. It was meant to punish me for being competent, she said, and I almost smiled at the audacity. Competent. That was one word for it. Charles knew I would build something important. He didn't want me to do it without you holding the leash. I didn't answer. The elevator chimed. In the days that followed, the advance that had made her glow began to feel like a bad credit card in a student wallet. Limit discovered only at the register. Calls went out. Calls came back. The Santa Barbara place paused. The foundation designer asked for clarity on governance. The would-be executive director sent a courteous note withdrawing to pursue a long-planned sabbatical. Photo shoots were postponed. A press release was drafted, then buried. I stayed out of her way and in the work Charles had actually left me. Spreadsheets with teeth, people with payrolls, companies that needed an adult in the room. I met with plant managers. I signed orders. I watched good foremen relax half an inch when I told them we were keeping the shifts where they were. At night, I read the clause again, the one about the 24 months and the oncology center, and felt something I hadn't expected, relief. The will had built a fence even my sense of obligation had to respect. I didn't have to field her overtures or wonder which nice gesture would become a lever. The document did the impolite math for me. Brooke kept up a front for a while. She posted a photo of sunset over a bluff with a caption about stepping into legacy. Likes climbed. Comments bloomed. Then there was quiet. A week later, she emailed a vendor to temporarily rescind brand assets pending governance review. The CC list included me, the council, and a handful of people whose names I recognized from the memorial program. The night she finally spoke plainly, we were at opposite ends of the kitchen island. 2 people crouched behind granite. 2 million, she said flatly, eyes on the sink. After everything. She looked up. And you get control. Control I didn't ask for. I said. But yes. She laughed without humor. Don't be modest now. I started to tell her about the oncology clause again, about how any scheme to merge or launder or dance around it would divert almost half the estate to the hospital and probably the rest to courtrooms. But she knew. She's always known the rules better than the referees. She just thought she could change the game. When she went upstairs, I stayed and read Charles's letter that had been tucked behind the will, the one addressed to me. It was short. He said he'd learned the hard way that money is a stage and people reenact what they practiced when the curtain was down. He said love needs guardrails like any other machine. He hoped the guardrails would protect me from my better angels. They did. They were doing it already. And as much as it stung to watch Brooke's architectural drawings for a life collapse in slow motion, I wasn't sorry. The will hadn't humiliated her. It had simply turned the lights on. Some plans don't survive daylight. The first salvo came dressed as civility. A week after the will stripped away the Santa Barbara house and her foundation dreams, Brooke began sending proposals. That was the word she used in the subject lines, proposals, as if we were joint partners evaluating a market entry, not 2 people circling each other in a room full of broken glass. The first was a typed, amicable settlement outline that read like a merger term sheet. She wanted an exchange of certain personal effects for a liquidity cushion plus naming equity in one of the operating companies if she abstained from contesting. The language was pure business school, meant to imply fairness, meant to make me think I was getting something in return for giving away ground the will had nailed down for me. When I didn't answer, the second volley came through Instagram. A photo of her at a charity event, the caption about continuing Dad's legacy through service, tagged with 2 media outlets and a donor who'd been at the memorial. She'd arranged it so her ring finger, bare now, rested against a champagne flute just enough to be noticed. The third wave was old-fashioned. Gifts. A leather briefcase with my initials embossed. A case of the Bordeaux Charles had liked to open at Christmas. A handwritten card in that perfect diagonal script. We can still build something worthy. Every gesture was a test of the clause, a soft push to see if she could make joint financial tie into a philosophical question instead of a legal one. I didn't bite. It was the family office archive that turned the air. I'd gone there to find shipping records for one of the companies. Charles was meticulous about supplier contracts, and I wanted to honor that habit. The archivist, an old man who still used a pencil to note retrievals, handed me a slim file with a vendor name I didn't recognize. The thread was brief. 3 weeks before Charles's death, Brooke had emailed requesting discrete document destruction. The vendor's reply was polite but firm. They required a trustee signature, which she couldn't provide. She wrote back once, pressing for urgency. Then the trail ended. It was enough to make me check the restricted folders. The archivist hesitated, then handed me a sealed envelope marked deferred. Instruction, Charles Dalton. Inside was a single typed page, signed and dated 6 months earlier. If there is any attempt to alter or destroy trust documents, activate disclosure protocol. Release library recording per moral conduct writer. Notify counsel for recalculation. My stomach tightened. I called the estate attorney before I could talk myself out of it. He confirmed. The protocol had been triggered the day Brooke contacted the vendor. The library recording was already queued for the trust council. 2 days later, they called me in. We met in a conference room lined with the Dalton family portraits. The playback was clear, Charles in his study, speaking directly to camera. His tone was calm, measured, but it carried the kind of weight that makes people sit straighter. He spoke of stewardship, of the temptation to treat inheritance as spoils instead of responsibility. Then, without naming her, he described actions that would disqualify any beneficiary who tampers with the record for personal gain. The room was silent when the video ended. The council chair asked if I had any questions. I didn't. Everything I needed to know had already been said. First by Charles, then by Brooke's own emails. Outside, I called her. They saw it, I said. Her breath caught, but her voice came out cool. Then I guess we're past the stage of negotiation. You passed that stage when you went to a document destruction vendor. That's not what it was, she snapped. You have no idea. I have the file, Brooke. And now so does the council. She hung up without another word. That night, her curated post stopped. The charity images disappeared from her feed. The briefcase and wine were never mentioned again. And for the first time since the memorial, I felt the ground tilt. Not under me, but under her. She'd spent weeks pushing for a settlement that would claw back some version of the future she'd drawn in her head. Now, the very structure she tried to bend had pushed back. The unexpected turn wasn't in my favor. It was the simple fact that, for once, I didn't have to do anything. The will, the clause, the recording, they were working on their own, a kind of quiet machinery Charles had built to run long after he was gone. And Brooke, who had always counted on talking her way through locked doors, was beginning to find out what it felt like when the key doesn't fit.